This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
I'm Nelson Grayburn. I'm a professor of anthropology at Berkeley, and I'm honored to be the first holder of the Barnes Chair in Canadian Studies. And today we have the last session, Managing the Arctic. There will only be one major speaker, but we have treasures in both. First, I'd like to introduce Frank Griffiths, who I hadn't met before, but I read his paper. It's the most erudite paper on the topic I've ever read, and you'll just be hearing a summary of it. He's professor of political science and chair emeritus of peace and conflict studies at the University of Toronto. He's written an awful lot, which I won't go through. He was director of the Center for Russian and East European Studies. He's been a visiting professor at Stanford University and a visiting scholar at the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge, which I'm going to be a consultant from March the 23rd next week. And perhaps most importantly for this, he has helped lay the intellectual foundations of the Arctic Council, and you'll be hearing a lot about the Arctic Council. And as the respondent, the one discussant, we have our own Professor David Caron, Professor of Law, Director of International Legal Studies at UC Berkeley. I think it's most germane to this session that he earned his BS at the US Coast Guard Academy. And he got his MSc in Marine Law and Policy at the University of Wales. He's also educated at the Hague Academy of International Law, Leiden University. He's been a visiting professor at Cornell University, Hastings College of Law, Director of Research at the Hague Academy of International Law. He's been a wonderful friend of Canadian studies, particularly in legal matters and to do with the sea. And he tells us that he has a book coming out very soon called The Oceans in the Nuclear Age. That is most appropriate, as I think the Arctic Ocean is the most nuclear of the oceans, with the icebreakers and nuclear submarines. I'd just like to say that the Arctic is no stranger to Canadian-American cooperation, invasion, conquest even, one might call it. From World War II, the United States needed much of the Canadian airspace and Canadian bases, especially during the Cold War. When I first went to Iqaluit in 1960, I counted 3.5 million 45-gallon oil drums left there by the US Air Force for fueling their planes. Before it became the capital of Nunavut, the Canadian government had taken them all away. Talk about recycling. And I must say that by 1968, we used to say more than 90% of the airstrips and runways in the Arctic were actually made by the Americans. That was changed when we made a 3,000-foot airstrip by hand with picks and shovels in Pavungnatuk, and it dropped below 90%. So I would like to welcome our speaker who's going to stand up here. Please, Professor Griffiths.
Thank you. It's the end of the day, and I'll try to be brief. I've been asked to speak for 15 minutes and no more. Maybe I can do it less. The subject is a long and difficult one, at least in terms of the paper I've written. I'm not going to summarize the paper. Instead, I'd like just to, as it were, pick and choose, cherry pick, and to talk about some other ideas I have about the management of the Arctic. The Arctic is actually quite unmanageable, and I'll be telling you why, and what we might need to do to make things more peaceable and perhaps less fraught with difficulty up there. The region is in the midst of very substantial change, as you know. We have climate change above all, but you have an interest in resources, in oil and gas, and in hard minerals that is ever stronger. And we have a geostrategic interest that comes with marine transportation, the possibility of shipping right over the top one day or along the east on the Russian Northern Sea route, or through the Canadian labyrinth, the Canadian Arctic archipelago. There are different ways of doing things, but these are all issues that are coming to the fore. And the Arctic may be regarded as a polar Mediterranean, really. It is a Mediterranean in that it's getting warmer and warmer. And there are a number of states that have a prime interest in what goes on in the area. If you look at that map, you see the Russian Federation has just about 180 degrees of arc. They are half owners of frontage on the Arctic Ocean. There is Norway for a tiny bit. There's Iceland, south really of the Arctic Ocean. There's Greenland, which is part of Denmark. There's Canada, and then the United States. There are 5 coastal states, which are the so-called Arctic 5. In addition, though, we have Finland, we have Sweden and Iceland, to make a total of 8 Arctic countries. And they are all very interested in seeing to it, I believe, that national interests are observed and looked after, but also that there's an element of cooperation. The desire for cooperation is uneven, and the way of going about it and seeking it is also rather uneven. I'd say no country has a strategy for the Arctic region and for its future. Canada has a northern strategy, but it's very largely domestic in nature. It's a strategy that looks to the evolution and the development of the Canadian North. And it has minimal extensions to the fate and the development of the region as a whole. In other words, the larger context within which the Canadian North will function, will grow, will do well or not so well. The same is true of Norway, for instance, where they speak of a high northern strategy. They don't use the word Arctic. In Russia, the tradition happens to be one that favors the word north also, Siever. That is the Russian attachment to the Russian northeast, where Russia really in some ways began ancient times ago. The United States is starting to develop, and I'll come back to that in a few moments, a strategy, it seems to me, and that's an effort of the Obama administration, and one to be watched closely. But there is no real strategy now, and I think there needs to be one. And a strategy is going to be quite a political thing. A strategy will be something that actually the governments who develop them won't be able to speak frankly about, because it'll be impossible to really say what their plans are and who are the troublemakers and what are the difficulties to be overcome. This is partly because I think already in the Arctic, as climate change works its way, we have a differentiation of hawks and doves in all of the Arctic countries. To some degree, it's stronger in one and less in the other, but on the whole, we have this differentiation. And in between, I would say there are dauks and hoves. There are more subtle, finely feathered birds, which are worthy of study. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I may mention some hawks and doves and speak of them in terms of isolationists and internationalists as they exist in Canada, and I think they exist also in Russia. And I'd say, by way of opener, even though I'm a few minutes into this already, that Canada and Russia have much in common in the way we approach the Arctic. And there is a great, strong commitment to possession, to what is ours. In Canada, we speak of sovereignty, sovereignty, sovereignty. And this is a principal objective. And the same is true in its way of Russia, where they're really concerned to maintain and be secure about their oil and gas future in the Arctic region, which is immense in the offshore, in the continental shelf and in the outer continental shelf. So there are potentialities for conflict. I think you see a lot of this hyped in the press, including the Russian press for that matter, by people who I call the purveyors of polar peril. And they are people who the newspapers and the editors of the media find interesting, and who will always take a story. But there's an exaggeration here. But there is a potential for conflict. But it's not great. There's not some great cold rush or Arctic meltdown or the origins of World War III in the Arctic, as some say. In fact, I think there is an opportunity. I'd like to talk about opportunity for moving the region in a direction that favors peaceful change, that favors stewardship, that favors cooperation. And I think this really should be the prime focus of a strategy as far as I'm concerned. A strategy for the Arctic is not a strategy of unilateral or national gain. It's a strategy of collaboration that creates a framework or a context within which sovereignty is best looked after in conditions of interdependence, in which security is also strengthened through collaboration that builds confidence, builds the habit of cooperation among states who are not really cooperating that much. In other words, a strategy, in my view, should be aiming to channel the future of the region toward the development of the region toward collaboration and away from conflict. This is something I think that is possible, is doable, but not easily, because the region is in many ways unruly. And I could go on at great length about this, but just touch a few points. It's very hard to get anything done in the Arctic, first of all, because in all of the Arctic countries, the north doesn't cut much ice down south. There are small populations up in the north. There's not many votes. To do anything is very expensive. The officials who want to do something usually have to cobble programs, especially international cooperation, together out of existing resources. It's very hard to get new money. The place is peripheral in its way. It is also a place, a region on the whole, that is pacific. There are no terrorists there, and I don't think there are going to be homegrown terrorists or others coming through from one country to the other in the region. There are some worries, but these are traditional ones of nuclear war, submarine cat and mouse games, and the rest. We go into this, but there's nothing really very threatening coming up soon. The expectation of war is not there. There may be clashes, there may be difficulties down the road, but nobody expects war soon, or great stress or high tension. What this means, again, that it's hard to get things done when there's so many other places in the world that demand attention of busy policymakers and officials. Why do anything in the Arctic when it's peripheral but also Pacific? I could go further, but let me say just a couple of other things. The region is fragmented. It is not a place that is given or inclined toward solidarity and action, collective action. There is the distinction between the coastal states that I mentioned, the 5 and then the 3 others. There is tension here. The 3 are inclined to meet separately. The 5 are inclined to meet without the 3. They have done so in Greenland, and they're going to be doing so at the end of this month in outside Ottawa in a little place called Chelsea. The 3 feel excluded. They're annoyed. They're irritated by this. And they don't like the thought of the 5 going on without them. There's also a distinction between the 7 that are not Russian among the 8. There's Russia and the 7, and there's quite a significant set of cleavages there if we want to look at them. But fundamentally, the real problem is that Russia itself is conflicted. And a strategy of cooperation for the region is going to have to deal with Russia above all. It's going to have to deal with Russian xenophobia, paranoia, and all of the stuff that we know that goes on in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the feeling of having been hard done by NATO and all the rest. And yet there is a tendency in Russia to cooperate, to above all to emphasize the rule of law and the law of the sea in the affairs of the Arctic region. And the Russians are very sensible about this, and I think this is a strong and a very real tendency in the behavior of the Russian government, one that has to be taken into account. The last thing I would say, though, in dealing with not only a Pacific, a peripheral, but a fragmented Russia, is that the region is not well institutionalized. The major body for cooperation and consultation is the Arctic Council, which includes all the 8. Also includes, by the way, as observers, it includes non-Arctic countries. China is there as an observer, as is Germany, as is Italy, as is Spain, as is now Japan wanting to be an observer. The observers sit at the Arctic Council at this main body silent. They're unable to speak. The Inuit and other Aboriginal organizations of the Arctic are there and able to speak freely. The Aleut can speak and say what they like, but Germany, China, say nothing. There's some irritation and annoyance about this, and I think there's a need to act and to make the Arctic Council more effective. What we need is a strategy, I think, and a strategy can be boiled down to a number of things. But fundamentally, what we need is the capacity for collective action. It's in short supply. It's not enough just to say, do this, do that. Let's go for oil spill cleanup preparedness. Let's go for ensuring a marine transportation. Or let's go for fisheries management. As the Arctic waters warm, new species of fish arise. There's all kinds of things that need to be done. Instead, we need to build the capacity for collective action. And how do we do this? In my view, there are several things that need doing. Number one, we need to elevate Arctic affairs from the official to the uppermost political level. We need, for instance, the Prime Minister of Canada to get involved and to start talking to his counterparts about the Arctic when they meet, to make this an issue. We need to engage others for Canada's case, for instance, to engage others, and I've mentioned China. The Chinese Navy, sooner or later, is going to be active in the Arctic. It will be there. Better for us to deal with the Chinese now, to draw them in on our terms, if you like, and to enculture them in the affairs of the Arctic rather than having them crash in later down the road. We need also to invigorate the Arctic Council, to invigorate governance. And to do this, there are various things that can be suggested. I think, first of all, we need to enlarge the Council to give the non-Arctic countries a voice, even while the consensus would be maintained by the Arctic 8. In other words, we'd have to allow a full voice for the non-Arctic countries, and for the Arctic 8 themselves having to justify what they want to do to the non-Arctic. We should do this, I think, as part of a process that includes the non-Arctic world in the Arctic and doesn't treat the region as a place apart. We need to, from a Canadian point of view, engage the United States directly and to see about ways jointly of the two of us, as Ambassador Pickering said, getting together to set new standards for joint action in Arctic North America. He mentioned a number of things that could be done, and I won't go any further. But there's a great deal that can be worked out for the Arctic waters of North America jointly. I think, too, though, Canada and the United States should be developing a strategy, a joint strategy for the evolution of the region as a whole. And that is a strategy that somehow will have to deal with the problem of Russia and Russian participation and Russian readiness to be a good steward, which is in short supply. They are not good stewards. There are various ways that I could suggest, and if we want to, we can discuss these, for doing this. One I just mentioned is that I think the United States should propose to Russia, and I think Canada should propose this first to the US, that there be a basic principles agreement for the Arctic. And that this would be rather like the basic principles agreement that the Soviet Union suggested to the United States in 1972. This is something that we could do. I'm rather optimistic about the immediate future in that the United States seems to be reconsidering its position on the Arctic and just what is going to happen. The Secretary of State said in an end-of-the-year interview that the United States now has to take the Arctic seriously and will take the Arctic seriously, will pay attention. She said this twice in an interview in Newsweek, and I take her seriously on this. But also, and more interesting perhaps, is the fact that the US Navy has produced a roadmap for the Arctic. If you read this roadmap, it's really, I think, quite encouraging. The aim of the US Navy for the future development of the Arctic is an Arctic that is safe, secure, and stable. I mean, what else could one wish for if you're trying to have a region that is sensibly governed? And if the US Navy is behind this, I think there is some hope. I would say, too, by the way, that if the Russian side emphasizes the law of the sea, as it does, the Russian Navy has to be part of the supporting coalition in Russia. There's a potential for Navy-to-Navy cooperation here, and it is important to begin with. There's more to be said, but my time is running out. Canada and the United States are going to be chairs of the Arctic Council in two-year sequences from 2013 to 2017. there's a 4-year window, in other words, for our two countries to chair the Arctic Council and to lead it. And I think there's a great opportunity here. We should take it, we should prepare now and come forward with a strategy. There's more we can do. Above all, I think, and we can talk about this in the discussion, there are ways of defusing the whole issue of the Northwest Passage in Canada-US relations and getting over it and getting around it so that it is no longer the inhibitor that it is for us, our two countries, to cooperate in the region. And all this, I think, adds up to potentiality for us, indeed, to find ways to be first movers. I like the phrase, in North America, as North Americans, the two together, leading in the Arctic, and by the way, helping create a perimeter for Canada that will perhaps reduce the stress on the border. If in the Arctic there is a secure perimeter, both of us cooperating, this goes to the heart of Canadian-American relations and Canadian interests. So again, the Arctic is germane. It's an area of opportunity. I believe we should take it. And I thank you.
Well, my thanks to the organizers. 20 years ago, on March 23rd and 24th of 1990, I met Franklin Griffith here at a conference on the Arctic. And my senior colleague had I was new to the university, and he had graciously listed me as the co-organizer, which I greatly appreciated as I came up for tenure. And that was Tom Barnes, always generous. And Jack Citrin earlier had used B's to describe him. And I would just add a couple, and that would be buoyant, brash, and bright. And he made scholarship joyous, and I will miss that. I really recommend this paper to you and give my congratulations to Franklin. It's persuasive. It is very clear when you read it that sentences have been packed very carefully with a lot of meaning. He has a more strategic political science perspective than I do, but we end up concurring on basic points. I mean, I agree very closely with his basic points. But to say that, I'm not trying to say that this is common. This is, in my experience, having gone to a lot of conferences, uncommon and important to emphasize. And so what I'm going to do is three things. One, I'm going to try and emphasize by restating in a different way two of his basic points. Second, he takes the arena and applies it to how Canadian strategy should be coming out, and I'll try to do the same for the US, ending, I think, in a similar place. And third, I just have a few particular comments. So I'm going to restate some points by pointing to some images of the Arctic. And I'll take this as one of his first basic points. This is a quote from his paper. The challenge here is one of leadership in a country not unlike others of the eight, speaking to Canada, is preoccupied with its Arctic possessions and unaccustomed to a pan-Arctic view of the region. And although that might seem clear, I just want to unpack that for a moment so we better understand what that means. This is the image that's dead. Each of these images has a law and politics inherent in them. And let me just say, that's me on the lower right. Back in 1975, we had broke ice for several weeks to get just south of 80 degrees north. And for the last 5 years, that entire area, for any skeptics in the room, has been ice-free in the summer. So, you know, in one's own personal experience, it's all that effort we did to get there. But the point about this first image is, as Douglas Johnson said, wrote in 1970, the Arctic is largely hypothetical. And all the law and politics really were dormant. We could write all about it. It really was not an issue. And this is dead in the sense that the Arctic at this time was a region only in the sense that it was absent from the map. It was a hole in the map. Whereas now, yes, there'll still be winter, but it'll be a place you go to and it's just more difficult to get to in the winter. Not the same place that it was for our fathers and our grandfathers in that way. So really, I think Franklin is talking about the second image and the third. This is a composite photo from 2005. And the point I want to make about the ring is the law and politics here are proximate and bilateral, because really they're national, as I think Franklin has said at several points in his paper. Essentially, as the ice recedes, it's no longer hypothetical. Every country bordering on the Arctic is engaged in an inventory exercise about what we're going to get out of this. And they're therefore concerned, proximate bilaterality, they're concerned with who their neighbors are, where the border is, and how much exactly we have. And you have this set of bilateral relationships, thinking going around the Arctic. And the point I want to make about the second image is, or image 2 we could call it, is it's inherently nationalistic. As Franklin said, the Canadian strategy is in some ways a domestic one. How are we developing our Canadian Arctic? And similarly for the US, it's very much about our Arctic. Now, in contrast, in image 3, we have this hypothetical image of the Arctic in at least 2030, some say as soon as 2015. We'll see, it doesn't really matter what the exact date is. What's important is, I think, two things happen when you reach this image. And one is that, exactly as Franklin said, it'll be much more apparent that the issue is governance, that now we really have a region to think about. It may be unruly, it may be many regions, but it is more cognizable as a space. It is a big space. I agree with Franklin that it's like the Mediterranean, but on the other hand, it's 5 times larger than the Mediterranean. So this is a very large area and supports his argument that it's unruly, or it's going to be hard to manage. I mean, really, if you think about it, there has not been a new region in the world since the age of discovery, and even that wasn't new, right? And this one, there are states in place, but what is opening is, and there are rules about why certain ones have preferences to most of it, but it's a new region, and it's going to have to deal with that emergence. So one point is, two things happen as you go to the third image. One is you look across the ocean. You don't look to your neighbors, you're starting to look as a region and wondering about that. The second is the inside looks out and the outside looks in. And Franklin describes this very well, but already Korea, China, Japan, everyone in Europe is asking about their place in the Arctic, in this mix. And so what I take Franklin's point to be in this first point is, he mentions at one point the drivers. There are two drivers. The drivers to the second image are oil and gas. The drivers to the third image, which is more about anxiety, is climate change. But really all the energy of industry, all the money they give toward mapping the bottom to the scientists, a lot of energy, therefore, of government is in image 2, really. And I think what Franklin's call is, it's a call that the NGOs make. It's a plea that you need to move out of image 2 or not be exclusively in image 2, and you need to start thinking about image 3. Where are you going to be as we go along? Now, Franklin's second basic point, this is sort of an end point of what he's saying about this first point. He sort of had a hockey metaphor here, I think.
An empty arena.
An empty arena, right. The second point is, for example, in his last recommendation, give priority to an Arctic fund, capacity building, participants in the council, and for Russian stewardship. Why does he single out Russia in that recommendation? Because Russia's presence in the region is so large that effective stewardship is impossible without it. And I just want to stress that to you for a moment, because once you start to see the Arctic in image 3, it is all about Russia. So if the issue is governance, the issue is Russia. The This complements what Franklin said. My research assistant did a little pie chart of how many degrees of longitude you have. And you can see even the US and Canada combined don't have the same as Russia has in this perspective. If you look at river discharge, I mean, Canadians here will know you have 2 major river basins going into the Arctic. Russia has 4. And in terms of actual outflow, it's much more than 4 times the amount you have out of your 2 major rivers. And their rivers are already industrialized, already polluted, and only going to become more so. This is a map that, if you know about nuclear waste, this is from 1991, at the end of the dumping of nuclear waste in the oceans. The International Atomic Energy Agency put this map out. No one knew at the time that Russia was actually dumping in the Arctic, so there is no mark up there in the Arctic. But near Novaya Zemlya, they have both done liquid waste and they have done actual reactors and solid nuclear waste, and importantly, if you see those numbers, in very shallow water. There is a big stewardship problem on that side. If you compare populations, economic activity, Russia's way ahead. It's hard to get numbers above the Arctic Circle. Franklin pointed to that the US has about 675,000 people in Alaska, but only about 15,000 are north of the Arctic Circle, on the north slope of Alaska. Canada, maybe 60,000, 70,000.
Well, in the whole of Nunavut, which is big enough to house the whole of Europe, there's about 30,000 people.
Exactly. Whereas Russia, 3 million people in that region. For Russia, this is already far along. And they are in a image 2, except their image of the Arctic is that a lot of it is theirs. You know, and so they're not so, they are looking domestically also, trapped in an image 2, but it's rather focused inward on themselves. Let me just say the hopeful note, although it's really being optimistic, going back to one of our earlier speakers, is they view it as their future. They have a very romantic notion of the Arctic. They view it as one way to finally open up their interior, that these rivers will finally be the way that they go up into their hinterland that has not been explored. Their recent Arctic security document really highlights that. So they put a lot of weight on it. On the other hand, it is not, to put it mildly, a robust regulatory state. So, so we come around to stewardship means helping Russia in becoming the major player in the Arctic. And the option against that is an Arctic that is not sustainable. So we really have little choice but to try and help this. Okay, so let me just switch to my last 2 points quickly. Franklin, taking these 2 points, said, so let's have a Canadian strategy that is more aggressively aiming at cooperation in the Arctic. What does that mean for the US? Curiously, the US and Canada are quite similar here. Canada is often in image 2, in my view, occasionally focusing on the Northwest Passage and on the Beaufort Sea. The US is in image 2, almost continuously focusing on itself. But they're both in image 2 for the primary part. It is true we have Arctic strategies developing, but one thing that comes out from this 2 things is they should have actually a common Arctic strategy, as Franklin is describing. And they need to work out the few issues which are going to be around for a long time, but which can be sidestepped between the 2 of them, I think. The US has another, because it focuses on itself, I'd say the error it makes is it thinks it is actually present in the Arctic. When if we go back to that pie chart, yes, it's a powerful nation, but actual frontage on the Arctic, actual areas you could dock ships, very, very little. And they have to be looking for partners in the Arctic. This leads to, if I could make a transition to these couple comments on Franklin's strategy. I think that Franklin recognizes that the outsiders, the ones outside the region, have a reason to be in, to be interested. We need to give them voice. And he would do that through a consultative status in the Arctic Council. I think from their perspective, that's not going to be enough. The two big shocks that are coming, and Franklin mentioned one of them. So if one shock was the Russians putting a flag at the North Pole, the next two shocks will be a Korean fishing fleet that goes through the Bering Strait and fishes in the high seas in the Arctic. And you got to remember, this is a big area, 5 times the size of the Mediterranean. If there are fish there, they're going to be there. The second is, Franklin pointed to a Chinese destroyer. Well, even worse, it might be a French destroyer. But they'll go up and they'll just tool around in the high seas up there, and this will be a wake-up call that this is not exclusively the property of the 5. Yes, unlike the Antarctica, they own a lot of it, and they control jurisdictionally a lot of it. But there's a big high seas in the middle, and we're going to see tension about that. So I don't think consultative status may be a transitional mode. I'm not sure it's the end point we're going toward. They certainly do not have a say in the local politics of each nation, but they're going to have a place in the region. The second is, in addition to the Arctic Council, I think the first step will be regional fisheries management organizations. And I say that in the plural because it's a big area. It may be as many as 4. We don't know where the fish are, what kind of stocks there are. As part of climate change, the fish are moving north. They will be there in time. And finally, perhaps you could comment on this, but I'm sure he's thought of a lot of things and then left them out in this policy paper. But one that's not mentioned is demilitarization, because in a way it's so far-fetched. Certainly we're not demilitarizing as far as submarines, but could you demilitarize the surface when it hasn't really been militarized yet, except for the Russian Navy, which is substantial on their side near their coast? And I view the Navy roadmap with, I'm a little more leery of the U.S. Navy roadmap. They're not a law enforcement agency. They don't deal with fisheries. They don't deal with customs. They don't deal with any of that. The Coast Guard does. We don't have funding for the Coast Guard to be there. So what does that mean that the Navy has a plan to be there? I don't see the function that important. Thank you.
Thank you. We only have a few minutes we can take. I've just like to ask if Franklin has any immediate comment before we go to the floor.
Maybe just 2 quickies about demilitarization and the U.S. Navy. I think it's very hard. It's going to be very hard to demilitarize anything up there, at least soon. The Russian Navy is based on the Kola Peninsula, large parts of it, and no way are they going to accept any crimping of their freedom of movement and essential protection of Russian security. The U.S. also needs to be up in the Arctic dealing with Russian submarines. Russian ballistic missile firing submarines that can fire from under the ice and need to be tracked and all that. I don't believe this area is open to any form of arms control or disarmament soon. We might, however, see a demilitarization of the ice and surface waters of the Arctic Ocean seaward of the exclusive economic zone. There's this, as it were, donut hole in the middle of the Arctic, high seas where there's really no national claim, except possibly in the outer continental shelf along the seabed when that is all delimited. That, I suppose, could be proposed, a demilitarization of the ice and surface waters. And we could have an agreement, conceivably, that would see there's no military activity on the ice, and there'd be no submarines surfacing through the ice. There would, however, have to be some exceptions made, I should think, for search and rescue, for people in need in that demilitarized zone. And who are the best ones to render emergency assistance in the Arctic? Well, it's almost certainly the military. So you'd see something, a need for a rather intricate arrangement. As to the Navy, I do have hopes. But the hopes are not that the Navy will do things themselves on the surface. The Navy is going to remain subsurface in the Arctic, I think. But they should get behind the idea of governance for a safe, secure, and stable Arctic. And the way to do that is in all kinds of non-military cooperation that adds up to stewardship, whether it's fisheries management, whether it's the organization of transit, whether it's any number of things we might want to think. If the Navy backs this, and the initiative will come from other agencies, we're going to have a greater likelihood of governance in the region, and maybe the Russian Navy will reciprocate, and through back channels, who knows what can be accomplished.
Thank you. Maybe we'll have one question there, and any other questions? We'll have them both at once, 2 and 3. Okay, 3 questions, short questions, all at once, please. Then we'll let the panelists respond.
Thank you. I suppose it's because I've served both in Germany and in Sweden. It's not obvious to me why we should let them into the Arctic. Sweden doesn't have a coast. The Swedish Arctic looks rather like Ottawa, actually. I know the Germans have done lots of research down through the years, but I'm not sure how that qualifies them for some kind of a oversight of the Arctic. If they want to play in the ice, they can go to the Antarctic, and we don't mind that. But why is it that we would want to include them? Now, I'm trying to keep an open mind, in my opinion, asking the question provocatively, but is there something I don't see here? Thanks.
And the next 2 questions right away, please. One here and one at the back. Right.
As David knows, I thoroughly agree with the regional focus that you both have put forward. But I want to ask you how you overcome the diplomatic hurdles. As I read the declaration of the 5 in their most recent meeting, on one hand, the good news is they want to cooperate and they want to adhere to the law of the sea. Of course, our United States hasn't ratified the law of the sea, but that's another issue. But on the other hand, the 5 nations made it clear in their declaration they're quite happy to exclude not only these China, Korea, or Europe, but also even the other 3 in the Arctic Council, and that they have no interest in any major new institutions of governance. In fact, they like this arrangement of the 5 having as much control as they can. So how do you overcome that political problem?
Thank you. And the gentleman in the blue shirt will solve all our problems.
Yeah, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the oil and gas potential in the area.
Thank you very much, the panelists, for these 3 questions.
Shall I go? Yeah.
One at a time?
All right, let's go one after the other. Let's try Germany and Sweden. To my way of thinking, you can have, yes. Sweden is an Arctic country, a founding member of the Arctic Council as well. I don't think we're going to get anywhere excluding them, turfing them out of the Arctic Circle, so to speak. They are there. The Swedes are there. And they are an Arctic country, perhaps more northern than Arctic, but there it is. They are there and they have interests. They have icebreakers. They do research. They're interested in shipping and Arctic shipping included, and ship construction. And one could go down the list. No way, I think, can the Swedes be turfed. So they're in. The Germans, the Italians, the Chinese, others we could mention, are already in the Arctic Council as observers. The door has been cracked open for these people because it is thought that they have something to contribute. And indeed they do. If you're going to talk about Arctic marine transportation, about search and rescue, and about all kinds of things relating to the marine environment, you've got to talk to the users as well as the owners, if you want to put it that way. The users are part of the thing. And I think a design that is restricted strictly to the owners is a design that favors condominium. That is, only the ones who are on the site are the ones who are going to regulate this. Now, there is, I think, in Canada and in Russia, a proclivity for this kind of thing. In Norway, I'd say not. I'm not sure that the United States has made up its mind fully But it seems to me it is a narrow, self-serving, and ultimately an unworkable way of treating a region that is part of the globe. It cannot be held apart. And in 1,000 ways, it depends upon the globe. It depends upon having champions outside the region telling people about needs to take care in the region. It cannot be only the Arctic countries who do this. So in my view, it's pretty clear that we do need to have an open door, and I would use that word for China in particular, the open door, and it doesn't mean they have a vote, and I disagree on this point. They may in the long term want a power in decision, but I think the trajectory for the reasonable near midterm future is that they be allowed to speak, but they're not going to be allowed to shape the consensus in the Arctic Council, which is held by the 8. And I think that's the way it should be, and I don't see why the non-Arctic countries shouldn't be happy with this, including the EC, as a step. What they're looking at is future consideration, I think, even now. We're going to stretch the future out for them.
So I agree with everything that was just said. Let me just twist it a little differently. I think the reaction partly that they shouldn't be in is a reaction that of the 5, for example, in Greenland, that it's ours. And so why are you coming in, right? And that is true jurisdictionally for some of the Arctic, not for all of it. So when I say that China will want a voice, I agree that they don't have a voice as to what, if you define the Arctic Council as the shared exclusive economic zones, no, they don't have a voice. They will have a voice on what happens in the high sea area of the Arctic. And it'll be in a different organization, perhaps, but they, so I would say 2 things. One, they do have a right to be in the center. They maybe are motivated by looking for something more right now, but they do have a right to be present there.
To be present is one thing. To have oversight is a different thing.
Correct. Correct. Let me just finish. Let me.
Mediterranean as an example.
Right.
How much oversight does Canada have in the Mediterranean? We have an interest.
Correct.
We have a presence.
Right.
But we're not running the Mediterranean.
So the second point is, if we switch to image 3, there are 2 reasons that they should have a voice. One is, I think we're mistaken to think that dialogue with Russia is going to be easy. And so personally, I agree with Franklin when he just said a moment ago, let's have as many voices in there as possible, because they're really going to be talking about Russian activities for the most part, if you want to just be strategic for a moment. Second is, the Mediterranean is a mess. The basic problem in the law of the sea is we cannot organize regional oceans, high sea areas. Now here we have a new chance. If you could have a high seas agreement in that area that somehow brought a moratorium on fishing till we even knew what was there. The fish are supposedly dependent on the ice, the presence of the ice. The whole thing is going to change when the ice is gone. There's just a lot of questions to work out. Personally, I wouldn't mind seeing the Arctic slow down in that high seas area. I mean, that may be just too much a precautionary tendency on my part, but there's a lot we don't know about the Arctic, and it's going to be changing for a while, at least in the fishery resources. So you can't really solve the Bering Sea problem. You can have all the fancy treaty tricks you want, but new entrants are a problem. So if you could somehow get this region, this high seas region, under control, I think that would be a good thing.
Have we answered your question?
Could I just add just one little thing, and that is, in my view, what we would be allowing is a say, but not a vote, to the non-Arctic entities. Let them speak, but they don't vote. That is, they don't have a voice in what is actually a consensual process. Finally, it's the Arctic 8 who would say what is going to happen. And I believe they will have to put up with that. And they're interested enough to put up with it.
Can I ask if you would like to say something small on oil and gas? We have a whole session on energy tomorrow, which will probably cover this, but in the light of what you've been suggesting, how does this tie in? That'll be our last answer.
I would say myself that we tend to exaggerate the oil and gas that's out there and what may be accessible and when it will become economic to go after it. There's quite a lot of oil and gas in shallow waters offshore on the continental shelf. But there's a certain amount of hype about the deep sea and the seabed and what may be out there in the outer continental shelf that is exaggerated and I think is unlikely ever to be accessed. Meanwhile, there's a new source of energy that has only just started. It's like shale gas. 5 years ago, we didn't ever hear of it. But now methane hydrates are now starting to be mined. The South Koreans are out drilling, and they're drilling in islands off their waters. I think there's a new technology here. There's an immense amount of methane in the permafrost of the Arctic region, immense, enough to fuel the whole of world civilization for perhaps generations.
And to increase the temperature, too.
That's right.
Right. that is problematic. Well, just two quick things. I agree with what was said. So first, in several conferences about this subject, I am constantly surprised at how many areas have not yet been explored. The maps are very basic about likely geological formations, so there's going to be a lot of surprises. Secondly, tying back to something that was said earlier about purveyors of peril, there is oil and gas in some of the disputed areas, but there's plenty, however much is there, there's plenty in other areas that are not contested. So I don't see the drive to be exploit in every area at once, pushing a boundary dispute to some critical point. And I think to your earlier question about how you move off the 5, why they would move outside, I think the only way is there will be perhaps one of these incidents of the destroyers or something changing. I think partly our only disagreement about the Arctic Council is what the Arctic Council is responsible for. If you view the high seas, the Arctic Council cannot control the high seas. They can control themselves vis-a-vis the high seas. But at some point, there's going to be a question about the others.
Thank you very much. I hope we've come up with a model for the management of the Arctic, and we're also hoping that the model of the management of the Arctic will be a model for cooperation in other areas. So I'd like to thank the panel very much, and to thank Alan Unger for everything he's done to get us together and get the right people together.